You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
Hi, I'm Jay Farner, CEO of Quicken Loans, America's largest mortgage lender. Spring will be here soon, so if buying a new home is on your to-do list, right now is the time to call Quicken Loans. Learn about which mortgage options make sense for you and get a jump on your competition. With our exclusive Rate Shield approval, the low rate you lock today is protected for up to 90 days while you shop for your new home. With a Rate Shield approval, if rates go up, your low rate stays locked. But if rates go down, you get that new, even lower rate. Either way, you win. Talk to us today at 800-QUICKEN or go to rocketmortgage.com to take advantage. Here's another great reason to work with us. For a record 9 years in a row, J.D. Power has ranked Quicken Loans highest in the nation in customer satisfaction for primary mortgage origination. Again, to lock in today's low mortgage interest rate and get the security of our exclusive Rate Shield approval, call us today at 800-QUICKEN or go to rocketmortgage.com.
For J.D. Power award information, visit jdpower.com. Rate Shield approval only valid on certain 30-year fixed-rate loans. Call for cost information and conditions. Equal housing lender. License in all 50 states. NMLS number 3030.
Hi, welcome to the Subway ad for the new Sesame Ginger Glazed Chicken Signature Wrap. How would you like it?
I'll take a...
Sports announcer at home?
Yeah, how'd you...
We just know.
My wife picks up the new Signature Wrap. It's got double the rotisserie-style chicken mixed with a sesame ginger glaze. She appears annoyed at me, but she shrugs it off. Those sweet and savory flavors are calling her name. She lifts the wrap and... she takes the bite! Incredible! And now she's closing the door on my... Subway, make it what you want.
Limited time only at participating restaurants. Double meat based on average 6-inch sub.
I'm little teapot, short and stout.
Here is my handle and here is my spout.
No, Dad, like this. When I get all steamed up, then I shout, tip me over and pour me out.
This is WWE superstar Roman Reigns. It only takes a moment to make a moment. Take time to be a dad today.
Visit fatherhood.gov, brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Lone Conservative. Now, after my interview with Orty Packard the other day, I said that we were going to be having on Jason Rantz this Friday. So I'm really excited to finally introduce him to the show. He's someone who I followed on Twitter for a while. I've listened to his show on iTunes a few times. He's really intelligent. He's someone who I especially can go to listen to what's happening in Seattle, because Seattle seems to have been, and we talked a little bit about this before the podcast, Seattle seems to have become this breeding ground for left-wing culture and left-wing ideas that wouldn't be implemented pretty much anywhere else in the country. Jason hosts the Jason Rantz Show on KTTH. You can find his show at ktth.com or on AM 770 KTTH Radio. So, Jason, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So, as I say with just about every podcast, because I'm bad at small talk, let's just jump.
Good,
right
I hate small talk. It's the worst. It's so annoying.
It's something where I have you on to talk politics, so let's just talk politics.
Exactly.
And I brought it up just a few seconds ago. What is it with Seattle being this place where I believe now they've implemented the $15 minimum wage? You have these heroin injection sites. You have a really bad homeless problem. You have extreme hostility, from what I've been able to see, toward the police in Seattle. I mean, what is it about Seattle specifically that is making all of these radical policies actually possible? I mean, it seems like Bernie Sanders' wet dream.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the demographics of Seattle. They tend to be a lot younger. They are very active as far as, actually going out and voting. And it attracts other like-minded people. And so you've created essentially an echo chamber of progressive viewpoints towards a whole host of different issues that are facing not just this region, but the country. And they put in place lots of progressive politicians. I mean, there was a poll that was done, I want to say this week, it might have been last week, that even though a lot of people are not happy with the direction of the city, specifically as it relates to homelessness, they still want progressives in positions of power on the Seattle City Council. And so that's really, it's interesting. It's not so much that the voters here who are upset, and there are a lot of people upset, it's not so much that they're upset with the ideology behind some of these programs that are in place that don't work. They're just upset with the people who are in charge, and maybe they just don't think they're progressive enough, or they don't think they're the right kind of progressive. So it's kind of fascinating to see on the ground.
So basically, it's not my ideology that's at fault here. It's just the people trying to implement my ideology.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly more voices like mine, although I'm a conservative. I'm one of like 17 conservatives in the Seattle area. It's like independents and more moderate Democrats and liberal Democrats. They're upset. It's just a question of whether or not they're upset with the ideology, which I think is the root cause of a lot of these problems, or if they're upset with the particular politicians who are in charge who, they just seem to think aren't, again, either progressive enough or they're a little bit too progressive. That remains to be seen. We'll get a better sense of the next election, to see who actually gets into the council, because we got 7 of the 9 seats are up for re-election. There's only a couple of, or 3 incumbents who are running for re-election. So it'll be interesting.
So do you see kind of a backlash? Because when we look at, and I hate to cite Europe here, but I'm only citing Europe because I think we've seen some European countries where there's been extremely left-wing governments that often there's this backlash that eventually comes at one point or another from the right. And obviously the right in Europe is very different from the right in America, but it just always seems as if there's an opposite backlash at some point. Do you ever see that coming to Seattle at all? Or do you think people are going to continue living with kind of their heads in the ground that these extreme policies don't work?
There's definitely right now some momentum on the side of the people who think the council went too far. Now, what that means, I don't know. I don't know if I would call it a backlash per se, but finally there are people who maybe have not been in control for very long, haven't really felt the kind of power that they felt after the activists in the community. And we're talking about just your everyday person who just didn't really vote, or if they did vote, they weren't really paying attention. When the council here decided to go after Amazon with a head tax, the council passed it despite polling overwhelmingly suggesting that it was unpopular. And then there was this movement to get the issue on the ballot. And that's only then did the council reluctantly say they were going to get rid of the Amazon head tax. And even then they basically said, oh, you guys, you're falling for the conservative propaganda coming from voices in Seattle, which again, I'm one of very few conservative. I love all that power that they pretend I have. I don't have that much power. And so since then, there's definitely been this momentum on the side of, mothers who are concerned with their kids walking to school, having to walk over human waste and use needles on the streets. You're hearing from, business people are saying, you know what, we're the backbone of this community. The economy is doing so well. It's thriving here because of what we're offering. And they're speaking out. They're still, what I find fascinating in this is lots of the voices that are speaking out, these are progressives. These are liberals. They're not really conservatives who are suddenly speaking out. There's some of that, but not very much. And I don't know if I would call it a backlash per se, but they're taking more notice. And I think they don't think the current crop of council members are reflective of the voice that they would like out there.
Yeah. I've noticed that a lot of people on the left who are more moderate are even getting fed up with the extreme left. And that's not to say that they ever agreed with them. It's just, I think it's a broader movement in the company that the moderates or country, I should say, not company, that the moderates who exist in the Democratic Party and the moderates who exist still on the left. And I think there's a hell of a lot of them. I think there's a lot more than a lot of conservatives tend to give credit for, are really getting fed up with a lot of the radical policies of, for example, some of the legislators and some of the leaders in Seattle. So it's, especially when it involves your personal property, I think regardless of your ideological affiliation, you're much more likely to start going after someone when it's your stuff that's on the line. But kind of getting into some of the specific issues of Seattle, like how they've tried to deal with some of the problems that they're facing. I talked to you a little bit about this before the podcast. It's something that I really want to discuss because, as I've said, as personally as someone who's a tradcon, I'm very conflicted on the whole idea of the war on drugs. I'm very conflicted on kind of the restrictive policies the United States takes toward a lot of drugs. Doesn't mean I personally condone drug use, but I think we've kind of been overly harsh in some senses, and I think that's led to kind of the heroin epidemic as of right now that we're seeing. What do you think about the way that Seattle's kind of been trying to deal with the heroin epidemic? Do you think, I mean, I know there's been things like heroin injection sites. Do these things help? Do they hurt?
Well, they don't help. They definitely don't help. I mean, you can look at the data. The problem is getting worse, and it's gotten worse under the progressive leadership. So, I mean, it's not getting better. You know, there's a difference between the war on drugs and going after and trying to treat the opioid epidemic. And I totally reject this idea that if only drugs were legal, this wouldn't be a problem. No, that's just you can take that position with marijuana, which is something I agree with, and I supported the legalization of marijuana. I still support it here in Washington State, but not with drugs like heroin. That completely changes the way you think, so that you're not really aware of what it is you're doing to yourself and to your community. My sense is if you all of a sudden decide we're going to legalize heroin, or we're not really going to go after people who use heroin, okay, fine, but then you're going to see a lot more zombies on the streets of your communities who are wasting away, giving all their money to feed this habit. And that is, that's to the downside of our communities, not just these people's lives and not just their families' lives, but our community in whole. What they've decided to do in this general region. Now we're talking about King County, not just Seattle. King County, of course, handles Seattle, which is the most populous, but also Bellevue, which is to the east of us by just 5 minutes, the second most populous area in King County. What they decided to do is basically they're not going to arrest anyone with up to a gram of a controlled substance on them, because they say these are addicts, these are people who are using it for personal use, and we need to treat them rather than throw them in jail. And you often hear this line of, you can't, arrest your way out of a problem. And I generally agree with that, but there's some caveats. When you put in place a policy like up to 1 gram, or in Snohomish County, which is just north of King County, they have it up to 2 grams. They're actually trying to get rid of that policy. But when you do that, you're not able to let the police do their job, not to arrest people who are addicts and users who are in need of help. That's not what it's about. They want to go after the drug dealers, the predatory drug dealers who are taking advantage of the system. They are keeping under 1 gram or 2 grams of heroin or meth or coke on them because they know they're not going to get popped, but they'll stash a whole bunch more a little bit further away from them. And that's how they're adapting to the laws. Now, let's say you've got a cop or a deputy who's going up to someone who is a heroin addict. Well, you catch them with 1 gram of heroin on them, you can then use as leverage over them. Hey, I'm going to throw you in jail unless you tell us who your drug dealer is, until you give us some actionable information so we can actually arrest the bad elements in society while we also get you help. If you take away that tool, you're not going to be able to go after the drug dealers. We have to be able to go after the drug dealers. That is a huge part of the reason why we have this problem here. It's not just because the drugs are, very effective in hooking you. It's because you're being sold it. And these people, especially the homeless, how are they paying for the heroin? How are they paying for the drugs? They're breaking into homes, they're breaking into cars, they're stealing other stuff, they're selling it, or they're bartering it for drugs. So it's this vicious cycle that if you don't let the cops do their job and go after the predatory behavior in all of this, you're making the problem worse. Now, I'm someone who believes in treatment on demand, but I also believe in, at some point, the whole idea of being compassionate is actually so compassionate that these people are dying. You see a program in Snohomish County, we're talking about Marysville and the city of Arlington. 2 relatively small cities, but they're dealing with the opioid epidemic and they're dealing with homelessness like every other community. What they've decided to do is they have a cop and a social worker. They interact with the person who's living out on the street, breaking the law, doing drugs in public, and they're very simple with them. They say, hey, we will give you the help that you need right now. We will give you a bed in a shelter. We'll put you in a detox program. We'll put you in any program that we can to get you help, but you have to take it. If you don't take it, we're either going to hassle you or we're going to arrest you. Now, sometimes they say, okay, arrest me. So they arrest him. The person goes back onto the street. Well, you know what? The next time the officer goes up to them, says, hey, I can do this all day. Same deal. I'll throw you in jail or I will give you the help that you need. It's totally up to you because we do not accept this in our city. And at some point, they either say yes or they leave the city completely. The people who say yes, they've seen significant results. They've seen significant results. And you look at Seattle, which has a similar policy in place in which we have something called the navigation team. It's Seattle police officers along with social workers who go into these encampments. They say, hey, we're going to clean this up, this encampment. We're going to clear it out in 72 hours. I've got the social worker right here who will work with you right now. We have a bed available for you right now. You can take it, but there's no arrest. If they say no, which they almost always do, they just move somewhere else because they can. There's no consequences to the behavior. And the idea coming from a lot of the progressive politicians here in the Seattle area is, oh, well, this is compassion because we don't want to force people to leave all their worldly belongings when we're really talking about trash or stolen goods. We don't want them to just have to go into housing until they're ready. Okay, well, they can be ready then somewhere else because this has an impact on the communities. It's not just about the people who are living out on the streets. It's also about the people who are choosing to play by the rules, who are paying taxes, who are paying a ton of taxes on property that goes up every single year because of how tax hungry we are. And their quality of life is deteriorating.
Yeah, I would say, especially when you have to live somewhere as expensive as Seattle, you shouldn't have to worry about walking through human defecation and needles to get to work. The only reason that I was kind of conflicted on the whole idea of a heroin injection site is that until you fundamentally change the policies that you're going to, I guess, use to enforce drug laws, or until you fundamentally change drug laws, I guess the whole issue has been that there's been not just a fentanyl epidemic, the fact that fentanyl is being infused with heroin and it's causing overdoses that even Narcan doesn't help, but the fact that it's also causing a wider HIV epidemic and other STDs and other bloodborne diseases. The only reason why I was a little conflicted on heroin injection sites is just that I guess I always saw it as something that people never said, oh, well, this isn't going to get rid of the heroin epidemic. It's just something to deal with some of the symptoms of the heroin epidemic that can only be gotten rid of with broader government policy or with changing government policy. You know what I mean?
Did you know that you can't overdose from heroin if you don't inject yourself with heroin?
No, I did not know that.
Because I mean, that's really what it's about, right? I mean, they present it as if you don't do this, people are going to die because there's no other way. Well, but there is another way. Treatment, right? It's getting someone off of this deadly drug. There's 100% another way. This is a conversation that started in kind of a roundabout and weird way. When it was originally pitched here in the region, they called it safe injection sites, which of course is nonsense. If it was safe to inject yourself with heroin, you would not need a medical supervisor at the injection site to begin with. You would just give them a bench and some mood lighting and set the mood with some nice music and candles. But that's not what this is about. This is dangerous. But number one, it started off by saying this is going to deal with the problem because we can give people treatment. As if someone who is going to an injection site, who's hooked on heroin, who's being given the free needle, the clean needle, and the supervision, as if they're going to be of sound mind to read the pamphlet that you give them about how they can get heroin. And then when you start pushing these activists who support this, and you say, okay, how many people are actually getting into treatment once they connect with you at this injection site? Because we've certainly seen what's happened in Vancouver, which, by the way, the problem has gotten worse despite the fact that they've had these injection sites. They don't give you the data. The data doesn't exist because there's not a lot of success stories in getting people off of heroin. I would take a moral position on this in that it is immoral to give someone the tools to do drugs that you know is going to ultimately kill them. The fact of the matter is, when we're talking about a heroin injection site, let's say they did one in Seattle and they've been talking about it. They've had a lot of trouble trying to find a spot for this thing. It's very expensive, but push that aside. Let's say they find the one spot in downtown Seattle. Okay, that maybe will attract a dozen or so people on a regular basis who happen to either live in that general area or sleep in that general area. So what about everybody else? You mean to tell me that the addict who lives, a 20-minute bus ride away is going to say, oh, I'm going to go take the bus down to the heroin injection site? That's just not how it works. I totally concede that it is safer doing it in a heroin injection site than not. Totally concede that. But also, it's safer to not do the drug to begin with. And if we're okay giving people the needles, why aren't they giving people the heroin? I've not actually heard a response coming from the left on that one. Because to your point, fentanyl is being laced in these, it's making it way more dangerous than it otherwise would be. Well, if that's the argument, then why aren't we giving these people heroin to begin with? And they'll always come out, well, we don't want to do what, why not? I mean, that's either the next logical step, or they're at least acknowledging that heroin is deadly. And so it's sort of a trick question, because if they're not going to do it, then they shouldn't be giving out the needles either.
That's a good point. That's actually, the only reason, say that again. Sorry.
Case closed. I win.
The only reason that I can think why they wouldn't give heroin, and again, I want to make it clear, not a shill for this, just morally confused on it. The only reason that I can think of why they wouldn't give heroin is because they don't personally want to, I guess, give people the drug, because then you're going to have all the drug addicts in town coming down to the heroin injection center to get free heroin, and that's going to make the problem even worse.
Yeah, but isn't that safer? Isn't that safer than getting the fentanyl?
That's a good point. I mean, that's the only argument that I can think of to counter
I'm using their logic to make a point that it's not particularly logical. It doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. I think so what we see often with ideologies and what we often see with philosophies and ideas like this is that it's not really going to be effective in one way or the other. I don't think it's going to be effective, or you're going to really get any sort of, I guess, concrete change or concrete results unless they think that you take the idea to their ideological extreme. So I would think that the heroin injection site for a lot of people on the left is a stepping stone to legalizing harder drugs, just like a lot of the abortion arguments, pro-choice, moving up what week you can abort the baby, is just a stepping stone to being able to, quote unquote, abort up until birth. So I think a lot of this stuff for a lot of people is probably, even though they won't admit it, it's probably a stepping stone.
Yes, but think about what the story is really about. So that position has nothing to do with the legalization of drugs. That has everything to do with the social justice argument, because they see people of color, communities of color, being disproportionately impacted by the drug arrests. And so that's the only reason why they're doing it, is because they want to make sure that people of color aren't being hit by cops for those charges. So it's a horrible position for them to take, because as much as I don't want anyone to be disproportionately targeted, which I don't think they're disproportionately purposefully targeted because of the color of their skin, but to avoid that, they are okay with communities of color overwhelmingly choosing a deadly drug that's going to eventually destroy not just their lives, but their families' lives. It's very twisted to me.
Yeah, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, that I think on the left there's a lot of false empathy in a lot of places. Like, for example, when you talk about Israel, I do think that not amongst the thought leaders in the Democratic Party. I think a lot of the higher ups, obviously Louis Farrakhan, Ilhan Omar, these people are anti-Semitic. But I think a lot of the base of the Democratic Party, who genuinely doesn't like what Israel does and who has a lot of animosity toward Israel, is tricked into thinking that animosity is just empathy for a disassociated, oppressed people. So that's why I say on the podcast all the time, the false empathy is wrong. It's something that we need to point out. And it's also why I don't think calling a majority of the Democratic base, as some people on the right do, or attributing a motive to them of evil, is necessarily, it's not a good thing. But I don't know. With a lot of these things, I think the false empathy, it causes a lot of problems.
Yeah, it's the appearance of caring about, it's basically the virtue signal, right? It's, I care. Yeah. Look what I'm doing. I'm retweeting a post from the ACLU, and I'm going to change my avatar because I care. So no, you don't. You're following in line because you think it makes you look good. It makes you feel good, maybe momentarily, without actually doing any good. And
I did that in high school when I was a lefty. I feel bad about it. I changed my Facebook profile picture. I was cringe, man.
Yeah, you should. You should hate yourself for that, dude. You should not have done that. No, I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong to do it, but I'm saying if you're truly passionate about something, that's not all you're going to do. Go ahead and change your avatar. Oh, cool. That's awesome. There's definitely importance in symbolism, and it can spur some change. But you got to do more than just that and actually know what it is you're talking about before you decide to do that. I mean, the people who want to jump on Israel to the point that you made about, Talib and Farrakhan and Omar, like, these people have no clue what it is they're talking about. I don't think that everyone who jumps on the anti-Israel stuff is doing so out of nefarious anti-Semitic intent. I think some of them are just really stupid. And then I do think that there's some nefarious intent in cases like Ilhan Omar. I think she's a rabid anti-Semite. I think Louis Farrakhan and Rashida Tlaib and anyone who falls in line with what it is they say and believe, they're doing so because they just do not like Jews. And it's really that simple. Mark Lamont Hill, same thing. You just don't like Jews, and just own it. And then we can just ignore you rather than pretending that you're actually going after Israeli policy, which they almost never do. It's not, you're not going after Israeli policy when you say, I think American Jews forget who they're fighting for. Like, yeah, that's not a policy. Sorry.
That's blatant anti-Semitism. I mean, kind of speaking off of Seattle for a second, I do want to get back to the how they're dealing with the homelessness issue first, like after this. But what do you think about, because you've made me laugh successfully, I think, more than any other guest so far on the podcast. So I want to hear your opinion. What do you think of kind of this rise of AOC as this cultural figurehead, even if she's politically, by political insiders, considered stupid?
I think most people consider her stupid. I'm not going to pretend that someone who won an election with like 13,000 votes and who's amplified on Twitter is the leader of the party. I'll take advantage of it to point out that she's an up-and-coming star within the party, but let's be very clear. I mean, her influence is due to people thinking that retweets and likes is important. I don't care with what some dude, with an avatar of a kitten says on Twitter. And I don't think that they're like thought leaders who are serious about taking control of the system. That's just, I'm not going to fall for that. I think that the media likes it because she's young, she's different, and they like that kind of drama. But I mean, okay, cool. What successes has she really had on a national level other than branding? It's kind of like Shama Sawan, a socialist Seattle city councilwoman here, who, although she's had some policy wins, for the most part, she's just a symbol of really good branding. And the people on the council don't like to work with her, even though they agree with her on certain cases. And now she's in a fight for re-election that's probably way closer than she had hoped it to be.
I was one of the people, and I feel so stupid for ever purporting this idea, but I was one of the people who was like, okay, you know what, you guys, you're underestimating AOC. I think she's actually politically smarter than a lot of people will let on. Not personally, but like I was seeing that at first she was starting to get her own little tiny political coalition in Congress. I'm like, before the Green New Deal, everything about that was revealed. She was already working on some big policy that a lot of Democrats in sentiment were starting to get behind. I was like, okay, guys, listen, I think she's politically smarter than a lot of people try to give her credit for. No. The instant I read the Green New Deal, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm never wrong except for this one time. But we've mentioned it on the podcast before that Twitter isn't real life. And I feel that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a lot of her popularity, as you kind of went over, it does translate to this idea that people think that likes and retweets actually amount to political power.
Yeah, but also think about just the regionality of it all. So let's say 90% of Seattle voters like Ocasio-Cortez. Okay, what does that mean? People already in areas that are already blue, that are already pursuing pretty progressive positions and policies and programs, they like someone who thinks like her. Okay, well, that doesn't mean that she's going to be an important figure anywhere outside of areas that already, before she even existed, was going down that pathway. So how is she coalition building in Kansas and Oklahoma and Utah and Arizona and Nevada and on Texas? Like, how is she doing that? They're not. And that's the problem.
AOC for president, baby. AOC for president.
Oh, please. Got a few years before she's eligible, but fine.
But okay, back to Seattle. Sorry, I had talking about Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. You have to bring up AOC at some point. But back to Seattle. There's been kind of, from what I've seen, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems as if there's kind of been a growing homelessness crisis in Seattle. And I guess that probably correlates with the drug crisis in a lot of ways. How has the city, like a lot of the left-wing city council and a lot of left-wing city figures, how have they been dealing with this homelessness crisis? And I'm assuming it's made it worse. So how much worse has it made it?
Well, it's made it worse because they're not proactive in attacking it. So you've got a navigation team that's showing some good results and getting people into shelter, and the council tried to gut the staff of the navigation team. You've got a council that leaks information when there's going to be a sweep at homeless encampments, and it's causing a whole bunch of problems. They want people to be able to sleep on the streets without being interrupted because social justice. And you had a council member in the last couple of years try to legalize encampments in parks, which was really funny because like months before that, we just spent tens of millions of dollars in new taxes to better our parks. You have council members who are trying to make it legal for cars and broken down RVs to camp out wherever it is they want without any consequence whatsoever. And we're talking about consequences to the homeless person because there's lots of consequences to the people who are living in neighborhoods that are impacted by this. I mean, you go down and walk to the stadiums in Pioneer Square, Soto. It's dangerous. It smells like urine. You had judges. A judge just recently put out a whole big deal. He did an interview actually on my show about how his staff is being attacked on their way into the courthouse by homeless people. Jurors are being either attacked or harassed or, intimidated as they're walking in. Our last sheriff was targeted by a dude with a knife. We talked yesterday to a business owner nearby in Pioneer Square who's about to leave Seattle because of the homelessness crisis, where he was threatened by a homeless dude with a knife the other day. I mean, we've got so many of these stories. I just did this big expose on, parents who are complaining to the city about their kids walking to and from school, and they're encountering used needles. They're encountering angry homeless people. They're encountering human waste. And the city's reaction is always like, oh, it's not that bad. Crime is down across the city. It's not that bad. We have a vibrant and diverse city. It's not that bad. I'm like, well, but that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about at all. And there's a reason why the city of Seattle and its failures has gotten so much national attention. I've been on Tucker Carlson now 4 or 5 times talking about this. I mean, it's because it's been that big of an epic failure, and it's happened. It's gotten worse in the last 4 or 5 years. And that's a problem. This is supposed to be a world-class city, and it's not.
It seems as if in a lot of left-wing cities, the homelessness crisis is just getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, look at LA. I don't know how exactly this is going to be fixed, just because it seems as if these cities are really not intent on changing. I mean, from what I've read, and maybe it's wrong at this point, but I remember reading something that said that at this point, sanitarily, LA is considered dirtier than a lot of Indian cities, which is absolutely ridiculous considering India is one of the least hygienious places in the world when you're just talking about the most populated areas.
Think about it this way in LA. There is serious concern over a version of a plague where typhoid is spread, where diseases are being spread by rodents that are living and encountering in these encampments. That's Los Angeles, where they're having that legitimate conversation. That should be a wake-up call, but unfortunately, no one wants to do anything for fear of looking like they lack compassion for people who are living out on the streets. And it makes no sense because the data suggests their approach is not working. And their approach isn't working because they're choosing to abide by ideology first and foremost and only. And when you do that on the right or the left, in the face of data that suggests it's not working, that's what ends up happening is the problem gets worse and it gets harder to fix.
And how these places are still, like, I mean, LA with all of its issues, with my dad is involved in business where you have to travel all over the country. And whenever business associates travel to LA, they basically always tell them, bring your most beat up pair of shoes to LA. And that's what you're going to wear out on the city streets. And then when you get inside the office, you wear your business shoes. You take them off, put them in a plastic bag, get ready to throw those bad boys away when you get home. So how it's so unsanitary, how it's so crime ridden, how it's so drug ridden. Again, even though I'm a libertarian, I guess, when I hate saying libertarian because overall I have disdain for libertarians with the exception of a few who I love.
Libertarians are so annoying. Can we stop with how annoying they have to be?
Thank you.
It's so I get hit up by them on Twitter so often. It's just like you know why I don't take you seriously? Because you're not very bright and you're really, really annoying. Just like pull back a little bit, man. Come on.
You're saying what we're all thinking. That's why I have always had an issue. Have you ever heard the term conservatarian?
No, but it sounds like it's going to make me enraged.
It's basically when you're someone, I've honestly identified with the term somewhat. It's basically when you're someone who has traditional values, but you don't believe that a lot of those traditional values should be legislated as they have in the past. So I kind of identify with it. But the issue is the people who often use it are extremely cringy and sanctimonious. And the other issue is it's got a Tarian in it. It's part libertarian. And a lot of libertarians, as you said what I was thinking. They're annoying. They're sanctimonious. They're self-righteous.
Well, and dumb. I said dumb too, I think.
Yeah, that too. So I think they have some good ideas, and it's why I'm more, I guess, to the left or more, I don't know, liberty-minded, however I can avoid saying libertarian on drug policies. But the issue is I don't support it as a cultural thing. I'm just someone who thinks that you shouldn't put users in jail until they're actually violating someone else's rights. But we still, again, toxic thing to the culture. And when you see these cities like
drug laws aren't even being, but those drug laws are not being really enforced. This whole idea of, we're not going into people's homes and knocking down doors to say, are you snorting cocaine, sir? That's not what's happening. I mean, when we're talking about these kinds of drug laws being enforced, we are talking about people who are out on the streets who are, in fact, doing something beyond just kind of hanging out and shooting up.
No, exactly. It's why I'm someone who also thinks that, yes, I do think there are some people in jail who are there just for non-violently shooting up. But at the same time, I acknowledge that a lot of the people in prison, the thing that libertarians and people on the conservative aisle will often rag on the prison system for. They'll say, oh, there's so many non-violent offenders in prison. There's so many people in prison who are there just for doing drugs. No, they're not. They're not there for just doing drugs. They did something else and they pled down. That's what happened.
Yeah, so that's usually the case. Although, again, look, I'm not going to get in the way of wanting reform so that some dude who's smoking a joint doesn't go to, I don't think you should be in jail for that. I live in a state in which marijuana is legal, and they just decided to throw out all of the, low-level weed convictions. And okay, that's fine. I agree with your point. I think it's important to point out that the folks who we're talking about sometimes, it's literally not just one time they got caught shooting up. That's not really what we're talking about. In some cases we are, and those are the cases that I can get behind. But we're talking about something else.
Exactly. And that's something that I wanted to make clear also, because I've always taken this position on the podcast that I am very, I guess, for the idea of not going to jail when you're minding your own business and you're doing some drugs that don't alter your mind in the sense that you go out and you naturally are inclined to violate someone else's natural rights to life or to liberty. So I don't want people to say, oh, he has Jason Rantz on the podcast, now he's a sellout. But what I was saying
is true, but it's not for me being on the show. Total sellout.
Yeah, no, yeah. Of course. It just amazes me that you have places like LA and Seattle, and not to insult Seattle too much, but that you have these places that have these drug issues. You have these places that have these homelessness issues. You have these places that are so easy on crime, not just nonviolent crimes, but it seems violent crimes. And they're still, to some extent, at least LA is, business hubs. I mean, when do you think this changes if things don't change course?
So I'll be able to better answer that question in a few months, because when we have a re-election, when we have a new council, we'll see who actually is being put on that council. There's still some very progressive people who are running, and there are some more moderates that are running. And my gut feeling here, at least, is the business community is fed up and your normal everyday resident is fed up. Can they actually get together and push a moderate Democrat or moderate liberal onto this council? If they can do that, then I would say we're in the midst of course correction. If they don't, then there's really no hope. And that's for at least a city like Seattle. There's just not going to be any hope. But we'll see. I don't know where it's going to go. I have a gut feeling, but we're still months away from any kind of action on this.
And the issue is you don't want Seattle becoming the next Detroit, because the thing is, big businesses.
It's not going to be. So that's the good news, at least not in the short term, right? I mean, Amazon is already starting to move some of their jobs, thousands of jobs, to Bellevue. And so the region in a general sense will be okay. I feel bad for people who are property owners right now who have been spending a lot of money purchasing homes, and then all of a sudden that's going to go into the tank. We're not going to get to Detroit levels unless something, crazy dramatic happens. And certainly if we were to get to that point, it's not going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. But I mean, we're inching closer and closer to that when you start hearing businesses like Amazon and smaller businesses deciding to move, saying that they're just fed up. I think what you were seeing here in Seattle is Amazon they're clearly upset with the direction, and they're clearly making some moves, but they're not going crazy yet. And I think they're waiting to see what's going to happen in this next election. I believe they spent, I want to say $250,000 or $200,000 into a local organization that's working on behalf of certain campaigns. Giving money to certain campaigns, sort of like a PAC. I don't think it's technically a PAC, but they haven't chosen who they're going to back. But that $200,000 is indicative of them being serious. I know it's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, but when we're talking about council races and we're talking specifically about the Amazon effect, that is a lot. And it shows you that they are paying attention. And if we get another council that's as crazy as this current one, as anti-business as this current one, you're going to start seeing more and more and more people leaving, and businesses like Amazon start to just completely move to Bellevue, which is, again, Bellevue by car is, without traffic, is a 5-ish minute drive from Seattle. It's across the water. It's across the bridge. It's gorgeous in Bellevue. It's a lot cheaper in Bellevue. They don't have quite the same issues as Seattle, and they've got a council and a mayor's office that gets along really well with the cops and gets along really well with service providers and gets along really well with the businesses there. So we'll see what ends up happening. I don't foresee Detroit, certainly not anytime soon, but there's a lot of writing on the wall that everyone would be benefited if they actually paid attention to.
Yeah, and I wasn't implying that it was going to become Detroit overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day. Yeah. Detroit wasn't torn down in a night. It's just something that I foresee happening in the distant future if things don't change. And that's not because I'm an expert on Seattle. I mean, it's just a lot of these big liberal cities that continue to try the same thing over and over and over again, and it makes things worse and worse and worse. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens. Hopefully Seattle turns around, but
fingers crossed.
I don't know, man. Especially for you, since you live there.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'll move away from I'll move to Bellevue like everybody else once we get light rail going, which will happen. It's supposed to happen in the next few years, which means it'll happen in probably about 20 years. So I may be dead.
So, by the way, Seattle has always struck me, and again, not an expert on Seattle, never been. Just from what I've seen of the culture in Seattle when I watch the news, it seems as if the political culture there is something that is rather hostile to right-wing thought and to the right, not just something that's just left think. Have you received any hostility being one of the biggest radio hosts there?
I mean, not counting the death threats, yes. But counting the death threats, yes. So yes, I have. The funny thing is we've got a version of like Twitter trolls who are very loud, and we've got our own people who they think because they've got a lot of retweets or likes, it's meaningful. The weird thing is most Seattleites, regardless of their positions on politics, tend to be rather passive aggressive, if anything. And that, it's annoying, but it's not threatening in any way. And then you've got some loud people who, if you think someone tweeting at you 10 times a day or 100 times a week, angry at you and calling you out, and they're talking to the same 25 people who always retweet and like stuff, if you confuse that for a bigger audience than it actually is, it certainly feels worse than it is. I've gotten my share of the death threat stuff and the crazy stuff, and you report it and you move on, but it's not awful. Every once in a while people will recognize me for stuff that I do, and they give me looks, but I haven't had much of a, the good news is radio. I don't do TV that often enough for them because it's on Fox, so they're not watching it anyway. So they're not really actively harassing me. And I don't anticipate that they would actively harass me anyway, but if they did, okay, it happens. It's tough.
Well, once you get to 20,000 Twitter followers, I've heard you magically become harassed in public as a conservative. So we'll see what happens there.
Hashtag goals.
So before we kind of drop off today before the podcast runs out of time. There's one last issue that I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on. And it's not really a Seattle issue. It's a national thing. I wanted to know who you think wins the Democratic primaries, because everyone was kind of having their money, everyone on the right anyway, kind of had their money on Bernie for a little while, because everyone was of the Shapiro bought that Biden's best day was going to be his first day, and that Biden was going to get chipped away at slowly by the other moderates in the field. But it seems as if, as of right now, that's not happening yet. So do you think Biden wins, or do you think Bernie comes in, or some dark horse in Buttigieg?
Well, it's not going to be Buttigieg. I think anyone who makes any confident prediction now is full of it. There's no one knows. You can look at the data and say, oh, of course, it's going to be Biden or Bernie. It's going to be one of those two. But the fact of the matter is you have one upset victory, and an upset victory could also mean coming in number 3 instead of winning the whole thing. Can change the whole trajectory of a campaign. The media message changes. If all of a sudden someone who doesn't even register as an afterthought comes in at number 3 or 4, all of a sudden the media starts to talk about it, and then it builds some sort of alliance. So it's way, way, way too soon. We're one Me Too moment away from ending anyone's campaign. We're one, not so woke comment from literally any of the 20,000 people running for president. We're one not so woke moment away from completely killing a campaign. The left has created such a very difficult roadmap for any of their candidates that they can lose steam very quickly or gain steam very quickly. So, I'm not going to sit here in May, the end of May, saying who's going to be the nominee, because it's so soon. It's so early. Yes, the odds are in the top 3 of either Bernie, Biden, maybe Kamala Harris, but that literally can. You asked me this question 2 months ago, and I would have probably had a completely different answer. So, I have no clue.
I think it's going to be Andrew Yang.
The Yang gang.
Get him at the end of town hall. I mean, listen, if a Democrat has to win, if they have to, I'd rather get $1,000 a month.
Yeah, well, don't count on getting that check, because it's not going to be Yang. I can definitely tell you who it's not going to be. I just can't tell you who it is going to be.
Well, the one thing I will say this, jokes aside, the one thing that I like about Andrew Yang is, aside from the fact that I do think he has some really radical left-wing policies, like the $1,000 freedom, quote unquote, dividend. I like that he's at least willing to talk to people. I do like the Democratic candidates. Obviously, they're not very high up right now, but I do like the Democratic candidates in some sense of the word, that when they're willing to talk to people. And there's a few of them in the field right now, and it's just sad that those people have absolutely no shot.
Yeah, but that's why they want to talk to us. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, they're so desperate that they're looking for anything, and that's why they're talking to us. If Andrew Yang was the front runner, he would not be talking to he would not go on Tucker Carlson. He wouldn't. He goes on there now because it could give him some street cred as not being scared to go on with the opposition, and it can maybe build him some better name recognition that maybe spreads on social media. But that's why they're talking. Howard Schultz came on. We did a one-on-one in-person interview. If he was the number one person right now, if he was polling high, he wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't talk to any radio. I mean, unless it's a nationally syndicated show. So I don't necessarily, I like that they talk. I'll certainly do the interview, but I'm not that impressed by people who are like, oh, well, they don't need to. Well, they need to talk to us. That's why they're talking to us. When they don't need to and they come on, that's when I give them kudos. I'm like, okay, good for you. Now you get that.
That's a good point. That's something I actually never really thought of. And by the way, thinking about it more deeply now, I fell into that trap with Tulsi Gabbard just because I saw her on Joe Rogan and I'd heard a little bit about her. And I was like, oh, well, you know what? She's willing to talk to the opposition. She's willing to talk to people who aren't necessarily going to agree with her.
Yes, because no one knows who she is. Because she has no name recognition. And so now all of a sudden she goes on Joe Rogan and maybe it trends on Twitter regionally for Joe Rogan fans. Okay, they're like, oh, who's this person? That's the only reason. Again, they're not saying yes because they want to. They're saying yes right now because they have to.
Well, what I was going to say is I was giving her some credit, and then I made the mistake, Rantz, of giving her unnecessary credit, because the instant, like a day after I give her credit, she comes out and with this ad comparing Nikki Haley to Al Qaeda. I'm like,
she's an idiot. Look, the only person you ever give credit to is me. Thank you very much.
I'll be sure to. And if you ever run for president, Jason, you have my vote. But with that being said, I think we've sadly run out of time here, and I can say safely, this isn't just a brown nose you. This has been one of the funnest interviews that I've had. This is the most I've actually genuinely
brown nose away. Keep it up. I want another 3 minutes straight of just kissing my ass. I love it.
Well, no, usually I have to do it's rare, but sometimes like I'll do a fake laugh because I don't like people feeling awkward. But no, this was probably the most I've genuinely laughed during a political interview. So,
Thank you.
Thanks so much, dude, for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So where can people find you if they want to hear more from you? And is there anything that you're working on right now that you'd want people to know about?
I mean, follow me on Twitter, Jason Rantz, R-A-N-T-Z. It's all one word. If you're interested in a 3-hour daily show or weekday show, Monday through Friday, we're live in the Western Washington region on KTTH. But for those of you who don't live in the area, you can subscribe to the podcast. You go to either KTTH.com or just search Jason Rantz Show on wherever it is you get your podcast. We're everywhere.
All right. Well, with that being said, Jason, this has been Jason Rantz and Eric Schaefer. Guys, thanks so much for listening today. And I'll see you all again next Monday with a very special guest. I don't have a guest yet. So I'll just say Ben Shapiro's coming on the podcast and leave it at that. All right. Have a good one, guys. See you Monday.